the invitation to talk to all of you, and I'm excited to spend time, uh, part of my afternoon, although I realize some of you are in different time zones. Um, as Crystal was saying, I think ideally the way I've structured this talk is I'll talk for a little bit, uh, introduce some themes and ideas and history, and then I'd be happy to field questions and engage in a back and forth with you. And then just one other thing that I wanted to mention is that I'm happy, and perhaps I could send it to you, Crystal, or to Yumi, or both of you. I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with you. So if you'd like it, it's certainly going to be available. Um, so as you can see here, the focus of my talk is going to be the Meiji era from 1868 to 1912. If time permits, I'll try to take you up to 1931, which is the beginning of for Japan, World War II, or what is often called the 15-year war. That is my aspiration. I certainly will, though, walk you through a discussion of the Meiji era from 1868 to 1912, focusing on really two themes: creating a nation and becoming a world power. So, as I said, the focus of the talk is going to be Japan from 1868 to 1912. And I think a good starting point is just understanding what the term Meiji means in the Meiji era. If you look at the characters for Meiji, it means the era of enlightened rule. That for this 44-year period, the goal was to help Japan and to move Japan toward the realization of what was called at the time civilization and enlightenment. And I think hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll understand a little bit more what civilization and enlightenment meant for Japan and why the leaders of the political government felt that Japan needed to move towards and achieve civilization and enlightenment. So that's just a little bit of background on the meaning of the term Meiji itself. The era began in 1868 with a political revolution, or as some scholars call it, a political coup d'etat. It was carried out in the name of the emperor by groups of lower samurai who were overthrowing what was called at the time the Tokugawa shogunate, which was an earlier form of government that was ruled by samurai. So in many ways, you have one group of samurai overthrowing a government run by another group of samurai. And so this is why some scholars call it something much closer to a political coup d'etat. And it came to be known as the Meiji Restoration. The idea is restoring the emperor to power. And the leaders of the Restoration were all very young. They were often in their late 20s and early 30s. And once they successfully overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate, they were determined to move Japan in a new direction, determined to initiate a period of revolutionary change. And what I want to try to do in this talk is to help you to understand that revolution a little bit better, both the nuts and bolts of it, but also the how and the why it was occurring. Now, no one would deny that the Meiji era was anything but an era of rapid change. One observer of the changes in the Meiji era said in 1912, when it came to a close, that it was the kind of era that makes you feel old before your time. And what this person was suggesting is that the Japan of 1912 was a very different thing than the Japan of 1868. Starting in 1868, there was really a hyper-developed sense of a need to change, to throw away the Japan of old, or at least parts of the Japan of old, and to build a new Japan. So the first part of my talk, the first section, is going to focus on the first 2 decades of the Meiji era, the 1870s and the 1880s. And it's going to focus on 3 themes: a revolution in Japan's worldview, building a modern nation state, and building a modern citizenry. Now, when the Meiji Restoration, this political coup d'etat, occurred, the new leaders all shared a sentiment that Japan needed to modernize, and it needed to modernize rapidly. That Japan needed to catch up with the West, who were seen as the nations who were dominating the world at that time. They needed to catch up with the West in order not to be taken over by the West and turned into a colony, as many areas of Asia were either in the process of having occurred to them, becoming a colony, or having it occurred already. So the new Meiji leaders felt first and foremost that the changes that they needed to initiate to make sure Japan was not taken over by the West, that it involved first and foremost a revolution in Japan's worldview. And they decided really right after the Restoration in 1868 to make that worldview clear. And so they issued something which is known as the Charter Oath of 1868. It's a very vague document. I tend to think of it as a 5-point plan to create a new Japan. And I won't go over all of the different elements of the Charter Oath, but the one I'll draw your attention to is the last one, which says, knowledge shall be sought throughout the world so as to strengthen the foundation of imperial rule. This was, in many ways, the essence of this revolution in Japan's worldview. It's not, as I'm sure Professor Patelka in the previous presentation emphasized, it's not that Japan was a closed country before 1868. It wasn't. But post 1868, there was a much more open and aggressively open desire to understand how the world works. And again, don't forget that the desire to understand how the world works was intended to make sure that Japan remained an independent country and not a colony of the West. So in the Charter Oath, then it really exemplifies this new desire to learn about the world. So soon after the Meiji Restoration, the government sent some of its top leaders on a 2-year tour of the West to figure out the source of Western power in the world at that time. And that 2-year tour was known as the Iwakura Mission. It lasted from 1871 to 1873, and here you see some of the members of the Iwakura Mission, including Iwakura himself in the middle. This was an official mission of the Japanese government, 100 Japanese government officials, many who had never been abroad or outside the borders of Japan, being sent to the United States and Europe. And the goal of the Iwakura mission was, and this is Iwakura's words, to discover the great principles which are to be our guide in the future. So the journey lasted nearly 2 years, and it really permitted a thorough examination of the world's most powerful nations at the time. The members of this mission visited the United States, followed by visits to England, Italy, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria, Sweden, and Switzerland. And during the course of that trip, one member of the Iwakura mission wrote about all the different places they were visiting in these Western countries. And I'll just read you the quotation from this individual. He says, "Courts, prisons, schools, trading firms, factories and shipyards, iron foundries, sugar refineries, paper plants, wool and cotton spinning and weaving, silver, cutlery, and glass plants, coal, and salt mines. There is nowhere we haven't gone." So for 2 years, the members of this mission traveled throughout all of these countries, taking copious notes In 1873, they returned to Japan, and some of the members of the mission put together a massive 2,000-page, 5-volume chronicle of the mission's observations and the mission's recommendations. And the most striking aspect of that report was its optimism. You might think that Japanese visitors would have been overwhelmed by Western civilization and the task of trying to match its achievements. But instead, what you find in this report is a bold self-confidence that what the West had accomplished was of recent origin, and that Japan, through careful planning and hard work, through building a modern nation state and building a modern citizenry, could catch up with the West. And that's what the leaders of the government in the wake of the Iwakura mission were determined to do, to make Japan into a modern nation and to make Japan catch up with the West. Now, you might think that the best way to understand this revolution in Japan's worldview is to use the term Westernization, to simply argue that Japan went on the path of Westernization to model its development along Western nations. And that's not wrong. But I think, and other scholars think, that it's a little bit too simplistic, and it doesn't really get at the complicated nature of the motivations of Japan's political leaders at this time. And so scholars have come up with different ways to try to complicate this idea of Westernization. And they've come up with different catchphrases. So I've put a few of them here. One scholar says that you can't forget that what was going on in the Meiji era was anti-Western Westernization, that there was an embrace of Westernization, but for anti-Western ends. So by adopting the techniques and institutions of Western society, they hope to eliminate all manifestations of Western power over Japan. So, one scholar is saying you can use the term Westernization, but you have to think about what the ultimate goal of Westernization was, and he argued there was a strong anti-Western streak in it. Another scholar has come up with a term called cosmopolitan chauvinism to capture one of the attitudes that was at the heart of Japan's revolution in their worldview. That is to say, cosmopolitan, they were open to the world, they were trying to understand how the world worked, but all of that openness was about self-strengthening. It was about strengthening Japan and focusing on Japan's strength as a nation. So it wasn't cosmopolitan orientation for its own sake. It was always about self-strengthening Japan. And then another scholar has added, though, that you can't just understand the Meiji era as an era in which it's all about Japan looking at the rest of the world. This scholar argued that there was a very important element in the Meiji era of selectively not just rejecting the past, the old ways in Japan, but also embracing some of the old ways of Japan to help Japan become a strong modern nation. So this term radical nostalgia, like looking back to the past as a way to make Japan stronger in the present, those advocates argued that, in fact, it was Japan's ancient values that gave it strength and authenticity in a rapidly changing global order. So I want to leave behind right now this idea of the revolution in Japan's worldview and begin to focus on building a modern nation state. But I will try to weave in some of these ideas that I introduced here to help complicate this idea of Westernization in Meiji Japan. So as you see, I'm trying to kind of complicate a simple story here. And I'm going to focus now on my second theme, which is building a modern nation state. That the political leaders were intent on making Japan appear to be a modern nation state, particularly to the watchful Western nations that were observing Japan's development after the Meiji Restoration. So there's really two parts to building a modern nation state. One of them is selectively getting rid of the old, the things that political leaders felt were holding Japan back from becoming a modern nation state in order then to build the new. And I'm just going to give you very briefly two examples here. One very early on, after the Meiji Restoration, the new government, which was staffed by former samurai, they decided to get rid of all samurai special privileges that had existed in Japan before 1868. Those special privileges included the ability to wear swords. It also included the right to receive a stipend, actual monetary stipend, because you held samurai status. The new government decided, both for financial reasons, but also ideological reasons, that those special privileges had to go. So they eliminated these status distinctions within Japan after the Meiji Restoration. And the reason they felt they needed to do that is that if you wanted to build a unified modern nation state and a unified modern citizenry, you couldn't have these status distinctions creating artificial divisions among the people, because that would create resentments and it would prevent unification that was crucial to building a modern citizenry. So part of this building of a modern nation state was getting rid of parts of the old, and then part of it was building the new. And the first part about building a new Japan that I want to focus on is this institutional revolution, building the institutions of a modern nation state. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But before I do, I want to just emphasize again, why build a new Japan? What were the political leaders thinking at this time about the primary reason that Japan needed to change itself? And I think that's captured very well in a song, a popular Japanese song from 1880. This song really highlights what you could call the predatory nature of the international order and how well the Meiji leaders understood that, especially in the wake of the Iwakura mission. You can see the lyrics for the song here. It says, "In the west there is England, in the north Russia. My countrymen, be careful. Outwardly, they make treaties, but you cannot tell what is at the bottom of their hearts. There is a law of nations, it is true, but when the moment comes, remember, the strong eat up the weak." So this song is really making clear that the Meiji leaders saw that the world is divided between the conquerors and the conquered, and they didn't want Japan to fall into the category of conquered. So they needed to begin to initiate this institutional revolution, what many scholars call a kind of top-down institutional revolution, where the fundamental institutions of the modern nation state are being built at the behest and at the guidance of the new government. And the goal was to make Japan look like, operate like, and be strong like a Western nation that was dominating the world at this point. So if you look at the woodblock prints at the time, you'll see some of these institutions of the modern nation state being built, all of these achievements of the 1870s and 1880s being put on public display through woodblock prints. So I'll just show you a few of them. Here we have trains, and the creation of a nationwide train system was a national priority of the government, and it was largely achieved by the end of the Meiji era in 1912. So you have trains as one of the key institutions of the modern nation state. You have factories as well. This is a woodblock print depicting a silk factory. And in fact, during the Meiji era, silk was the #1 export of Japan into the global economy, followed in fact by green tea and cotton textiles. And just as a kind of side note, there's a really interesting recent book on the export of green tea to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it doesn't just cover the Japanese story, it also covers the US story, where I get much to my surprise, green tea was very popular, particularly in the Midwest in the United States, where people tend to drink it with milk and sugar. Um, but I mean, back to what we're talking about here with the Meiji era, these factories then were key institutions of the modern nation state that the government was actively taking a role in creating. Um, Architecture as well. Western style buildings were being built, especially in major urban metropolises in Japan, as part of this undeniable Westernization boom. This is a post office in Tokyo, and then there's also popular parts of Tokyo like Ginza, where the streets were lined with newly constructed Western style buildings. Maybe one of the most famous Western style buildings of the 1870s and 1880s was known as the Rokumeikan. And this is where Japanese elites of the day engaged in practices such as ballroom dancing. They held parties, not only amongst themselves, but with Western visitors and Western elites and Western political figures who were coming to Japan at this time as well. So there really is this goal of building the institutions of a modern nation state so that Japan looks like and operates like a modern nation, a civilized nation. Um, this slide gives you, I think, a little bit better overview of all of the different types of institutions that were being built in the 1870s and the 1880s. Um, there's a navy, a postal system, an army, a school system, a judicial system, a banking system. Here you can really see how the 1870s and 1880s was this era of revolutionary building, literally building the institutions that are forming the foundation of a modern nation state. Now, what's also interesting to me about this list of institutions is how eclectically the Meiji political leaders are borrowing from the rest of the world. They weren't simply using one nation as a model. They would take different institutions and different ideas from different nations, paying particular attention to how those institutions would fit in the native Japanese soil that they were being planted in. So just to give you a little bit more of a specific sense of this eclecticism, in terms of educational borrowing, you can see that different parts of the educational system that the Meiji leaders were building were coming from different parts of the Western world. So from Germany, for instance, there was this idea that you should build only a few elite public universities to train the elites who are going to be ruling over the nation. From Britain, they borrowed this idea of the importance of character building through athletics and moral discipline. And then from the United States, they borrowed a lot about vocational training, particularly teacher training and normal schools. They took a lot of ideas about how to run a good normal school from the example of the United States. So one of the things then that's an important part of this story of building a modern nation state is Japan's turning to the West for models of development. But at the same time, the leaders of the Meiji government were not simply throwing away all of the old Japan as well. So the Meiji era isn't just about building the new, it's about also selectively valuing the old. And this is related to this idea that I mentioned earlier that one scholar has called radical nostalgia. And you can see it in the example of building a home for the emperor of Japan. So let me just talk briefly about this to illuminate this point about radical nostalgia. Now, the emperor of Japan was located in Kyoto, Japan, which I'll just go to here quickly. Kyoto is right here, if you can see the arrow that I have, and then this is Tokyo here. The Emperor of Japan was located in Kyoto until 1868, the year of the Meiji Restoration, and then was moved to Tokyo here, where he lived in a kind of temporary residence as the new government got basically was putting itself into place. But by the 1880s, there was a sense that we need to build, the government, need to build a permanent home for the Emperor of Japan. But then there was a debate about, well, where should that be? Should it be in Tokyo, where the emperor had been moved to in 1868? Or should it be Kyoto, where the imperial family had lived for hundreds, if not close to over 1,000 years before 1868? So there was this debate over where an imperial palace should be. The two candidates were Tokyo and Kyoto. And the two groups that were arguing it out, you could call them antiquarians and civilizationists. So the antiquarians argued that Kyoto was the best place to put an imperial palace, because what they said is that a modern nation needs a deep past. It needs a spiritual center of gravity, or else it's just going to come off looking like a recently made and weakly anchored nation. And they said Kyoto could serve as that spiritual center of gravity. So they argued the emperor should be moved back to Kyoto and the imperial palace built there. And they also argued that, well, Tokyo, it has some real downsides. Number one, it's not very deep in history when compared to Kyoto. I mean, Tokyo's history, going back before 1868, dates back about only 300 years, whereas Kyoto's is over a millennia. And Tokyo, pre-1868, was also the center of the Tokugawa shogunate that was overthrown. So it would be a constant reminder of the political revolution that occurred in 1868. So that was the argument of the antiquarians. Now, the civilizationists said, well, that's all well and good, but you don't understand how the modern world works. We need an imperial palace in a place that is a symbol of national wealth, strength, progress, and civilization. And Tokyo serves that better than Kyoto. Kyoto is this remote place. It's too old. It's inappropriate for an age of civilization. We need to focus Japan on the present and the future. And that is captured by Tokyo. Now, in the end, a compromise won out. And Kyoto became the place where imperial succession rights occurred, so that every time a new emperor was crowned, he would go back to Kyoto to be crowned emperor and to become the emperor of Japan. So in some ways, Kyoto is the home, the old home of the emperor, but he would live permanently in Tokyo because Tokyo was the administrative heart and the symbol of this new Japan. But what this debate shows is that these people felt, these leaders of the government felt that in order for Japan to become a modern nation, you need both the new and the old. You need both Tokyo and Kyoto to be a modern nation. So the point I'm trying to make is that if you want to understand this idea of Westernization, you can't simply see it as everything about Japan's past is being thrown away. It's not. There's selective parts of Japan's past that are being used in the present to create a stronger future for Japan. And you can also see this briefly in photographs and portraits of the emperor. This is a portrait of the emperor in 1872. He was relatively young at this point, right around the age of 20. And he's dressed in the garb of aristocracy in Japan at that time, including the hat above his head. A year later, though, as Japan is moving to embrace this idea of Westernization, this is the same person, dressed in Western-style military garb, sitting in a chair, not looking entirely happy or comfortable, but nonetheless signaling the new direction of Japan. 15 years later, this is what that same person looks like. This was an official portrait, looking much more comfortable in the Western-style garb, sitting in a Western chair with facial hair, which was common among Western political leaders at the time. So you might look at these three images and think, okay, well, this is Westernization at work. This is Japan abandoning the old and embracing the new, which was the Western. But I'll just add one more picture of the Meiji Emperor's grandson from 1928. You see here, he's donning the garb of the aristocracy, the old Japan. And the point I'm trying to make is that this impulse to borrow from Japan's own past, not just borrow from the West, was an essential element of building a new Japan, and one that often gets overlooked if you're simply using the term Westernization. Okay, let me briefly then, and then we can pause and I can field questions, go over the third theme of the 1870s and 1880s, the theme of building a modern citizenry. There's 3 points I want to briefly go over. That the new Meiji government knew that institutions alone, whether trains or factories or schools, do not make a modern nation. You also need to build a unified citizenry, or at least a compliant citizenry. And this is an important theme of the revolutionary changes of the 1870s and 1880s. Now, the first thing the government realized they were going to need to do to build a modern citizenry is to deal with dissent, because all were not happy with the revolutionary changes after the Meiji Restoration. There was a major rebellion in 1877. It's known as the Satsuma Rebellion. And it was led by a group of samurai, particularly a man named Saigo Takamori. And these samurai resented the changes that the Meiji government were initiating. They resented the end of samurai stipends. They resented the replacement of a warrior class of samurai by a conscript army. And these disgruntled samurai both passively resisted by not sending taxes from their area to the central government, refusing to implement the reforms of the central government. They engaged in passive resistance, but also armed rebellion. In 1877, Saigo Takamori, a major figure in Japan at that time, and 15,000 samurai marched on Tokyo. They wanted to overthrow the government and restore the privileges of the samurai. As they made their way to Tokyo, their forces ballooned to about 40,000, but ultimately they were crushed over 3 weeks of fighting by the government forces. Now, Saigo Takamori himself remains a well-remembered figure. On the left, you see a statue of Saigo that appears in Ueno Park in Tokyo. And then, in fact, on the right here, you see a movie image from the early 2000s film, The Last Samurai, starring Watanabe Ken, whose figure right here, who was called Katsumoto in the film, was really based on the historical figure of Saigo Takamori, a figure that one scholar said really exemplified this idea in Japanese history of the nobility of failure, of people who have failed in what they've tried to do, because Saigo's rebellion ultimately failed, but their impulses to rise in rebellion were seen as noble and worthy of praise. So the government is learning that not everyone's happy with this top-down revolution in Japan, and they're going to need to learn how to deal with dissent. After the Satsuma Rebellion, there soon began a popular rights movement It started small or smaller with just samurai, but then it broadened after the Satsuma Rebellion to include people from all social classes, particularly wealthy peasants. And these people began to really become political. They began to organize local political associations and rallies. They founded journals and circulated political ideas across Japan. They delivered petitions to the government. They read and discussed political philosophy, both Asian and Western. And what they began to do is to rise in, I wouldn't necessarily always call it rebellion, although there were rebellions within the popular rights movement, but in disgruntlement. They wanted a voice in a new government, and they began to prod the leaders of the government to make that happen. And this forced the government then to turn to constitution writing as something that they needed to embrace. They felt in the 1880s that Japan needed to write a Western-style constitution, in part because it seemed like something all the Western nations had. It was a prerequisite of modern nationhood. They also wanted to write a constitution because they felt it would lead to a revision of the unequal treaties, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But in light of what we've been saying here, they also hoped writing a constitution would quiet the opposition and rally the populace behind the new regime. So this debate over constitution writing broke down into two sides. One side, led by a man named Okuma Shigenobu, felt that a British-style constitutional system was preferred. But then the other side, led by Ito Hirobumi, felt that a Prussian-style system was preferred. The British-style advocates, many of them were from the freedom and popular rights movement. And what they were arguing for is a new government and a parliament that gave sovereignty and voice to the people. They wanted a strong representative institution of parliament established in Japan. Now, Ito and the other people who favored the Prussian model, they wanted a strong monarchy with limited representative power, and they wanted to keep sovereignty firmly in the emperor's hands. They were very aware and frightened of the danger of social upheaval that they'd seen in the Satsuma Rebellion, that they'd seen in the freedom and popular rights movement. And this is why Ito favored the Prussian model. Now, in the end, without going into all the details, Ito and his faction won out, and a new constitution was written across the 1880s that was very much modeled on the Prussian constitution. And what you have then is this new constitution being promulgated in 1889, and a new parliament opened in 1890. And this is the end of this first period that I've been talking about, from the 1870s, the 1880s, this era of an institutional revolution, the beginning of building a modern citizenry. And it's important to note, as a final thought, that Japan was the first non-Western nation to write a Western-style constitution and to open a Western-style parliament. And the leaders of the Meiji government felt that this was really, in many ways, a crowning achievement of Japan's efforts to become a civilized and enlightened nation. So before I go on to the second half of the Meiji era, I'll pause, and I'd be happy to field any questions either through the chat, although I must admit I'm less skilled with the chat, or in person as well.
Yeah. Great. That's Professor Jones. Thanks for this detail, structure. I think I can, now I would invite our teachers. I know some of them posted the questions in the chat. If you would like to unmute, I think so. I would just call your name if you don't mind. So Christiane, would you mind unmuting yourself? Do you want to ask your question? Because I know you posted several questions.
Yeah, sure. What was the name of the song that illustrates the reluctance towards the Western sense of industrializing? I'd love to share that as a resource with my students.
Is this the song from 1880 about the
Yes.
predatory nature of international politics? Is that the song?
Yes.
Um, I'm going to look into that. I actually don't know what the title of it was. I think it was just one that was kind of sung at the time in different venues. But I will look into that to find the name of the song. Uh, but those are,
Okay.
a translation of its lyrics.
Yeah, I think it'd be excellent to share and just have the students feel the attitudes at the
Hmm.
time. But if you are able to share that at some point, that'd be wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, of course. Thank you for the question.
Great. And I think, yeah, that's really, I think that can be as an authentic material that serves in the classroom for a lot of secondary teachers. Okay, great. Thank you, Kristen, for the questions. And Adam, sorry if I mispronounced your name. Adam, you also pose very great questions. Like for teachers, that your question really aroused my attention. So would you like to unmute yourself
Yeah,
to ask?
sure. I'm wondering about what the efforts were for English education in terms of modernizing and how effective it was.
Hmm. Um, in the Meiji era, there was all kinds of debates because, these leaders were not, in a sense, following a playbook. They were inventing this new Japan as they went along. And so there were a lot of debates about how can we make Japan appear, but also work more like what was called at the time a civilized nation, very much along Western lines. So there were debates in the Meiji era about adopting English as a kind of almost national language, Christianity as a national religion. Um, but there was a lot of pushback to those ideas, in part because it's related to this theme of radical nostalgia as well, or ambivalent feelings towards Westernization. Throughout the Meiji era, kind of woven into these idea of Westernization is also a questioning of the costs of Westernization. If we're going to adopt English as a language, or if we're going to adopt Christianity as a national religion, neither one which had native roots in Japan, then what kind of nation are we going to be? What will be our national identity? So most of those debates occurred in the 1870s, which was the real period of experimentation among the political leaders. But the debates about English and also the debates about Christianity, neither one of them obviously took permanent root in Japan.
Adam, do you have follow-up questions, or you think that answer your question?
Um, yes, I mean, obviously, later on in the future, they continued their efforts to introduce English, and
Mhm.
you know, you know, I'm just wondering what kind of the long-term effects, I guess.
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's sort of long-term perspective. Because like English education in Japan really, not surprisingly, took root and began to build steam during the American occupation of Japan. So right after World War II, for the 7 years that the Allied powers, led by the United States, occupied Japan and rethought all kinds of different elements of Japan, from economics to government to society, including language education. And that's when English language education began to take firmer roots, both because of the pressure from the United States, but also, it can't be denied an interest on the part of Japanese as well. And you can see, like, for instance, I don't know if any of you watch Japanese films, but there's a wonderful film by a Japanese filmmaker named Ozu Yasujiro, called Tokyo Story, which I always get this wrong. I think it's 1953 or 54. And in Tokyo Story, one of the younger characters is at school and he's practicing his English as part of the film. It's a kind of wonderful scene, but it really suggests that by the 50s, after the US occupation, the teaching of English had really taken root within Japan.
Great. I also dropped the link for Tokyo Story in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah. Great. I watched that movie before, and that's a part I remember as well. As an educator, I always like pay attention to anything that's relevant to educator.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think now I'll go to, so I'm going this chronologically. So Angie,
Hmm.
would you like to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Okay, I'm actually on Angie's Zoom account. This is John.
Oh, John. Okay, great. Sorry.
Sorry, no problem. But I was just curious about when you were talking about the split in the functions of the two capitals. Does the succession still take place in Kyoto today, or was that?
Yeah. Yeah, Kyoto becomes part of whenever you have a new emperor, they go to Ise Shrine, but also Kyoto is part of the succession rites. But the imperial palace is still located in Tokyo.
Sure.
So there still is this kind of split identity or dual functions of these two places. Kyoto has kind of become the museum of Japan, and
Yeah.
especially today with its problems with over-tourism, it's related to Kyoto in some ways as a city presenting itself as the museum of Japan. And then Tokyo becomes the cutting edge of a futuristic Japan.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Great. And I think Anna, would you like to unmute yourself? Because I think you have some thoughts that to share, and also the comparison you're asking a question that can involve with a comparison that's like something that will be very beneficial for us all hearing from you.
Yeah, I was thinking earlier when Professor Jones was mentioning about the reasons why Japan had modernized. I couldn't help but think of one of the lectures I listened about Sarah Payne when she mentioned that Japan learned some things from China when they did not fully modernize. I think the problem was that they were so heavily embracing the Confucian traditional values that they thought of themselves as a middle kingdom. And so they missed an opportunity to modernize, and that's what led to their downfall. And so looking to the mistakes, Japan thought, well, we better not make the same mistake that Japan did, otherwise we'll be encroached by the Westerners. And so they sent a lot of dignitaries, officials to learn, but also, I guess, in a way to spy what they're doing and integrate that so fast. I always like Meiji era. And then I also remembered from the previous seminar that you were mentioning about traditional values. And Professor Pateka wonderfully mentioned about women as the bearers of history. So they would don kimonos. I think it's burden, whereas men would basically Westernize themselves. So just two thoughts.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a very important point, especially your earlier one about, the larger regional context, the larger Asian regional context. The leaders of the Meiji government knew what had happened in the Opium War. They knew that China had been defeated by a much stronger, militarily speaking, Britain, and they knew the costs of that kind of defeat, not just short term, but long term, and how that was really chipping away at sovereignty in China. And the new Meiji leaders were determined, as much as they could, to prevent a similar fate for Japan. So you're right to emphasize that larger regional context in understanding the Meiji era.
Great. And then I think we got 3 last questions. I think Xu, would you like to unmute yourself?
I just want to say I love the pictures of Emperor Meiji that you showed earlier, sort of showing how his clothing style changed over time. I'm just wondering, how would you describe his perspective on modernization, and how much power did he have in this process?
That's a wonderful question, and it's one that historians really still debate because, in theory, especially according to the new constitution, which I wasn't going to go over all the elements of it, in theory, the emperor was the political sovereign of Japan. All sovereignty lay in that figure. Kind of an older idea was that the emperor was largely a figurehead and didn't have that much of a political role. But I would really say over the last 2 to 3 decades, and this is true for the Meiji Emperor, and it's certainly true for the Showa Emperor, the grandson of the Meiji Emperor who ruled Japan during World War II, that a large number of historians have really researched the different ways that the Meiji Emperor and the Showa Emperor exerted their own political will and their own political desires. So they weren't necessarily political rulers who lived above the clouds, that they were very much involved in decision making and making clear what their desires were. Now, they weren't the only ones making decisions, but they were much more involved than I think an earlier understanding of the emperor seemed to suggest.
Right. I think that really answered the question, Lee's question, and also I think to speed up a little bit, I think Adam, would you? Because I just saw you posted another question. Do you want to ask that question, or you want to save it for later? Okay. Okay, I would take it as I think Hannah and Misty has like longer questions, and because they haven't asked, so I will probably invite them to say first. But I will keep in mind that Adam, you got that question. So Hannah, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your questions?
Sure. When I'm teaching about this time period, the textbooks always say Westernization is one of the things that they adopt. So I love that the complicating nature of it and those anti-Western Westernization or cosmopolitan chauvinism that you were talking about. So then as you were pulling up some of the woodblock prints, I'm thinking about things like the ballroom dancing. Why would the ballroom dancing or the clothing or certain ones of these things, why would they choose to adopt those elements of the West? Like, how does that lead towards that self-strengthening?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the first thing to emphasize is that there actually was a fair amount of criticism of ballroom dancing by certain political elites who felt that wasn't the proper path for Japan to go down. It seemed a kind of slavish adoption of Western culture that put Japan and Japanese leaders in literally in the terms of these dances in an awkward position. So that's one important point. And there were other slides that I had that I decided to take out for time purposes, but that really show, and I could re-include them with the slideshow that's circulated, that even throughout this period of Westernization, there was real ambivalence about how far we should go to Westernize. Like, what was the appropriate border to approach where Westernization seems palatable and not demeaning? And then what does it mean to cross that border? And some people felt the ballroom dancing definitely did. So I think that is another important point to remember about Westernization, even as it was really moving ahead, full steam ahead, to use a kind of train metaphor. There were critics of it and who felt that it was ultimately leading Japan down a path of subordination.
And I think Misty's question is somehow relevant, a little bit relevant to this. Misty, would you like to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, that was along the same lines. I'm just wondering if sort of these Western aspects in ballroom dancing, is that, really the elite that are doing these things? And is this kind of a pop culture that then makes it kind of, like this newfangled fancy thing that people want to take part in? And, we got rid of the samurai distinctions. And is this a new kind of distinction kind of thing between classes or elites?
Yeah, no, that is true. That it was definitely the elites who were practicing this, and they came in for a fair amount of lampooning, as elites often do, as they adopt these new practices. So it definitely, there were the creation of these divisions, and this was one of the very difficult things that the Meiji government was trying to navigate in building a unified citizenry. Because on the one hand, they realized in order to become a modern nation, you need a narrow band of elites to manage modernity in Japan, to manage the government, to manage corporations, to manage foreign policy. So you needed to cultivate an elite, but if the distinction between elites and the rest of society became too stark, and there seemed to be too much of a distance between them, then you're beginning to jeopardize this project of building a sense of a unified citizenry where everyone has some kind of common ground on which to stand. So it was in that context particularly that the criticism of ballroom dancing occurred, because they felt that was creating almost too much of a gap between the vast majority of the population who had nothing to do with ballroom dancing, and then these elites who seemed to be taking on the trappings of Western civilization.
Great. I think the last question, Adam has your hand up, so please feel free to unmute. And then after this question, we'll proceed with the second part of the presentation.
Okay.
Adam?
So I heard Stephen Kotkin, a historian, say that Japan could be considered Western, even though it's not geographically, because of like rule of law and democratic institutions. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
Oh, I mean, certainly. I mean, today and even back in the Meiji era, which is our focus right now, it adopted all of the trappings of Western civilization, from building modern factories to writing a modern constitution to, as I'll talk about in the next section, building a modern empire. So the Meiji leaders were very careful to make sure that Meiji Japan checked all the boxes for being a modern civilized nation, which at that time was based on the Western example. Now, I do think, and if we were talking about the wartime era, I could talk about it more. There were people in the 30s and 40s who rejected that formulation and who argued that up until this time, it was only thought that there was one path to becoming modern, and that was following the Western example. But a lot of what was going on in Japan's wartime years in the 30s and 40s is trying to realize something that scholars have called non-Western modernity, East Asian modernity, that Japan was trying to prove to itself and to Asian countries and to Western countries that you could be both Asian and modern at the same time, that there was an Asian path to modernity, not just a Western path. That sentiment was not as prevalent in the Meiji era, but it certainly was animating a lot of thought and action during the wartime years. But I think your general question about is Japan, does it possess the trappings of, at this time, Western civilization? Yes, it does, and could no doubt be considered, in that sense, a fully Westernized nation. But there was always ambivalence, and this is what I'm going to talk about in a minute. Is that enough? Will Western nations accept us as an equal if we become a Western-style country? And that's where, in the second half of the Meiji era, you begin to see some real struggle with the West over this question of acceptance and equality. So maybe that's a good segue into this second section.
Yes, I think we're all ready for the second part of your presentation.
Okay. So I'll move to the second half of the Meiji era. Remember, it goes to 1912. So we're talking about the 1890s and the 1900s. So after the 1870s and 1880s, when Meiji leaders, political leaders, felt that Japan was beginning to tick off all the boxes for being a Western-style nation, they had factories, they had a Western-style parliament, Western-style constitution, a modern educational system, a modern military. There was one thing that they didn't have, and that was a modern empire. They looked at all the Western powers of the world, and they all had empires. And that was the one area where Meiji leaders felt if Japan is going to survive and thrive in the modern world in the end of the 19th, early 20th century, they needed to become a world power, and that meant building a modern empire. Now, building a modern empire is going to require two renegotiations. One, renegotiating a relationship with the West and the Western powers, which dated back to the 1850s, but also, and really in some ways at the same time, renegotiating a relationship with Asia. So those are the three themes that I want to go over in trying to understand some of the changes that were going on in the second half of the Meiji era. So crucial to becoming a world power was thinking about this question of how did the West view Japan? Did the West view Japan as an equal? After all, Japan had transformed itself in the 1870s and the 1880s. They'd caught up with the West in order not to be taken over by the West. But now the question was, would the West accept Japan as an equal, as one of the great powers of the world? And a lot of that question is wrapped up in Western views of the Japanese as a people. So the first question I want to think about is, how did Japanese leaders at the time feel that the West saw Japan as a race of people, as a nation of people? So here you have a newspaper cartoon dating back to our first time period from the 1870s. And this was presenting to Japanese the idea that within Japan, there are three levels of enlightenment. There's the unenlightened, this is the samurai, the half-enlightened, someone who wears Japanese clothes, but also Western style clothes. And then there's the fully enlightened. And the leaders of the Meiji government knew that this is how Western nations almost broke down the Japanese populace, divided into these three different populations. And their goal in the 1870s and 1880s was to grow the ranks of the enlightened, to make Western powers see Japan and Japanese as fully enlightened peoples. So the transformations that occurred in the 1870s and 1880s, part of the reason they undertook that was to achieve this goal. But here, if you look at a drawing from the 1890s, so 1893, the period that we're talking about now, by George Bigot, this is an etching of Japanese, and it may be a little bit hard to tell, but these are Japanese. He was a French drawer, cartoonist. He has images of Japanese here, all dressed in civilized clothing, but in the mirror, the reflection back is the Japanese as ape-like creatures. So the idea is that no matter how much the Japanese dress themselves up as civilized people, at heart, they're still uncivilized, or they're less than fully civilized. So they can't be equal to us. There's this inequality between Japan and the rest of the Western world that's being entrenched in these sorts of visions of the Japanese. So even in the 1890s, there was this very strong sense that the West treated Japan unequally, as not part of the great powers of the world. And some of this was not only true in image, like you see with Bigot's cartoon here, but also in reality, dating back to the 1850s. Because in the 1850s, what you had put into place by the United States and other Western nations were what are called unequal treaties. These were treaties that Western powers, through what historians often call gunboat diplomacy, forced the Japanese shogunate at that time to sign. And here's just an example of one from 1858 between the United States and Japan. It's the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. And you can see that these treaties entrench an unequal relationship between the United States and Japan. And underlying that unequal relationship is the sense of the United States as the civilized power and Japan as the less than civilized power. So there were a whole series of conditions that were written into these unequal treaties, that Japan had to open up certain ports to global trade. They had to permit foreigners to reside in those ports. They lost tariff sovereignty. So the Japanese government could not set the tariffs for goods that were coming into Japan. That was set by the Western nation. That free exercise of religion, particularly Christianity, needed to be sanctioned within the borders of Japan. And then perhaps the most humiliating from the Japanese perspective of the conditions is this imposition of extraterritoriality. Basically, it's a big word that suggests if a Western, in this case, let's say United States citizen, commits a crime in Japan, that person will not be tried in Japan according to Japanese law because it's considered uncivilized law. They will be tried in the United States in front of a court in the United States, which operates according to civilized law. So in both image and reality, because these unequal treaties, they were put into place in 1858, but they were still in effect in the 1890s. So both in image and reality, what you see is an unequal relationship between Japan and the West, even though Japan had achieved so much in the 1870s and the 1880s. So in the 1890s, then, the government was really intent on reorienting Japan's relationship to the outside world, particularly to the Western world. They wanted to be accepted as an equal. And so they're going to engage, as I said, in these two renegotiations, renegotiating a relationship with the West, but often what that meant was also renegotiating a relationship with Asia, because the Japanese knew that Western powers saw Asian nations as uncivilized. So there was a Japanese thinker, a very famous one, named Fukuzawa Yukichi, and he wrote, you see him pictured here, he wrote a very influential essay called Saying Goodbye to Asia. And what he was arguing was that Japan had to break away from Asia because it was seen as a backward region of the world by the West. And that Japan must then abandon Asia, align with the West, but then, and this is the interesting thing, Japan should then begin to treat China and Korea like the West treats it, as a place in need of civilizing and uplift. So even predating Fukuzawa's very famous essay, which is from the 1880s, and I can include a copy of it for any of you who are interested, because it's very short and it's good to use in the classroom. Even before Fukuzawa's essay, the Japanese government had forced Korea to sign an unequal treaty. So they start carrying out the same unequal treaties that the West had imposed on Japan as a way to show the West that we're on the path to civilization. So Japan in the 1870s, 80s, and particularly in the 1890s is beginning to try to renegotiate a relationship with Asia in order to renegotiate a relationship with the West and to be seen as an equal of the West. And so here you really begin to see how the nation building of Japan in the Meiji era also included empire building as a further and perhaps even final sign of achieving civilization and enlightenment. So during the 1890s then, Japan became much more involved in continental affairs in Asia, because here you have Japan, the island nation of Japan, Korea, China, Russia, and other areas. They become quite interested in what's going on in Asia, in large part because they'd been for 2 decades building a modern military. And they felt they were going to use that military to begin to build a modern empire. And one of the main places that the Meiji leaders were concerned about was Korea. A Western advisor to Japan at that time said that Korea was like a dagger pointing at the heart of Japan. And what this person was saying is that if another power took control of Korea, then it's just a hop, skip, and a jump for that same power to threaten Japan. Now, at the same time, if you look at the map of Asia here, China shared a border with the Korean Peninsula. So they were also very concerned about what was going on in Korea in the 1890s. And what was going on is that the Korean government at that time was being shaken by domestic disturbances. There were some major peasant rebellions in Korea at this time, which was creating political instability. And the Japanese government and the Chinese government both felt that this is not good. We need to intervene into the Korean Peninsula to try to stabilize things. So they both did at the same time in 1894, and that caused the first outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 1895. And this was a war that lasted all of 8 months because Japan won this war decisively. And if you look at the woodblock prints at the time, you begin to see a little bit of the meanings that Japanese leaders were gleaning from this wartime victory. So let me just show you a few. Here in this woodblock print, you see that the Japanese are almost always dressed in modern military garb, where the Chinese military, such as it is, usually lying either injured or dead, are not dressed in modern military garb. So there's this clear distinction between civilized Japan and uncivilized China. If you look at this woodblock print, this is a Japanese military here, but what I want to draw your attention to is the light that's being shown on the Chinese soldiers. This is echoing this, in some ways, Western imperialist idea that the essence of empire building is shining a light on the uncivilized nature of different regions of the world, and then through shining that light, showing these countries the path to civilization and enlightenment. So here in this woodblock print, you begin to see even how Japanese artists are using the ideas of Western imperialism to suggest that Japan is going to do the same thing for China. They're going to shine a light on the uncivilized nature of China, and they're going to lead them to enlightenment. And then finally, you see here in this image, another telling idea, which is you see this one Japanese soldier who has a Chinese child, and he's holding it and tending to it. And this is, again, this Western, originally kind of Western imperialist idea that the Western nations are the adults and the colonies are children. And these adults are, like any good adult would, taking care of these children and helping them to mature. So here as well, you see this echoing of a Western idea, but the argument being made is that Japan is now the adult and China is the child. And Japan is going to build its modern empire in Asia, just like Western empires built it all around the world. So this war ended in 8 months. It ended with the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895. And according to that treaty, Japan got its first formal colony of Taiwan. It got a large indemnity, and they also got these unequal rights in China. Now, they did also get one other thing, which caused a real stir among Western powers. And I'll show you the map of East Asia. If you can see, I hope you can see my arrow here. There's a peninsula here in China. It's called the Liaodong Peninsula, that the Japanese also got a leasehold on. Basically, they're kind of informal control over it. And it was very important as a port city. Now, the problem was there were already a lot of Western powers in China, including France, Germany, and Russia. And they didn't like Japan getting that leasehold as a result of wartime victory. So they basically intervened and said to the Japanese after the end of the Sino-Japanese War that you need to renounce your leasehold of this peninsula and you need to return it to China. And if you don't, we will engage in military action. The Japanese were not in any position to take on France, Germany, and Russia, so they did cede this territory back to China. But this event, which came to be known as the Triple Intervention, the intervention of these three powers into Japan's wartime victory, this was stinging to the Japanese. It was humiliating to the Japanese because it felt like the Western powers were once again not treating Japan as an equal. After all, they just won the war. Many leaders in Japan felt this was the just fruits of wartime victory, but the Western powers didn't see it that way, and they intervened. Now, in fact, it is the case that in 1898, Russia, with the assistance of France and Germany, forced China to lease that very same peninsula to Russia, and then French and German investors built railroads for the Russians in that area. So there was certainly self-interest in the Triple Intervention. But from the Japanese perspective, there was nothing but humiliation. And this is a famous Japanese, Tokutomi Soho, who said here that after hearing about the Triple Intervention, I became almost a different person psychologically. It happened because we were not strong enough. And that he realized that Japan's progress would ultimately depend on its military strength. So after the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895, the Japanese government further pushed to move Japan closer and closer to becoming an equal of the West. And they had some major achievements. The Anglo-Japanese Alliance of 1902, so in a formal alliance between Japan and arguably the great power of the world at that time, was a sign to many Japanese leaders that we're moving in the right direction. We're moving towards equality. So you have these kinds of alliances, and you also have Japan increasingly becoming involved in the Asian continent, and particularly involved in carving out a sphere of influence. Because this is something that the Western powers were all doing in Asia. They were carving out different spheres of influence in this whole region of Asia, but particularly in China. And a particular area of interest to the Japanese was this northeastern China, known as Manchuria, so just north of Korea. This was an area that was resource rich, but it was also an area in which the Russians, you can see, are just right north of Manchuria, were also interested in and had been there for quite a long time. So without getting into all the details of what's going on in Asia at this time, right around 1900, there was a major rebellion in China known as the Boxer Rebellion. A lot of Western powers, including the Japanese, sent in troops to China after the Boxer Rebellion was suppressed. The troops were supposed to be removed, and Russia refused to withdraw their troops from Manchuria, so they're building up a much larger military presence. They also started to become involved in affairs on the Korean Peninsula, and so Japan begins to send its troops into not only Korea, but also Manchuria, and this is going to lead to the outbreak of a second war within 10 years. And this is the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. This is a different war than the Sino-Japanese War, at least from a Western perspective, because the Sino-Japanese War was two Asian powers fighting each other. Russo-Japanese War was often seen as a Western power fighting a non-Western power. It's the first major war of the 20th century, and the world was watching to see which side was going to win. Was a non-Western nation going to defeat a Western nation? A few decades before this, that was unimaginable. But now, because of the Meiji era transformations, it all of a sudden becomes possible. And for many in the West, it was a frightful possibility. So what I want to show you with the Russo-Japanese War is postcards, Western postcards that were depicting and trying to ascribe meaning to the Russo-Japanese War. And through these postcards, you'll see the course of the war as well. So this first postcard shows Japan as a woman, so as a weaker nation being propped up by England and falling prey to the Russian bear. So here we see a clear sign that the world, or at least the creator of this postcard, is not seeing Japan as an equal of the West. And yet there are other postcards that suggest the exact opposite. This is a set of postcards that almost look like trading cards or like baseball cards. These are some of the leaders of the Meiji government and the military, and they're all shown in Western style garb. So we have this almost Western confusion. Is Japan a kind of weak, almost geisha-like nation, or is it a modern military power? There was a consensus that Japan was a small nation, and this postcard suggests that the Russians were just going to eat up the small Japanese. Even though they could dress in modern military garb, they were still small and they were going to lose to the Western power. But as the war unfolded and Japan started to win some major battles, the postcards began to change. And if you read this one from top to bottom, left to right, you see the Russian trying to placate the little Japanese jumping up on the Russian's shoulder, subduing the Russian, defeating the Russian, and sending them home. So the war is beginning to make people feel that maybe this non-Western power is a new great power in the world. This war was also seen in racial terms. This is a postcard that's depicting the Meiji Emperor fighting the Russian bear. And if any of you know French, it's being depicted as the grand duel between the yellow and the white. The yellow race of Asians and the white race of the Russians. At the same time, the Japanese military is being seen as a kind of warmongering, vicious, backstabbing, doesn't quite play fair military. You see postcards suggesting this as well. But as you're getting to the end of the war, you're starting to see signs that Japan is going to win. They're going to gobble up the Russian Navy, and they're going to win this war. Now, they didn't win it as decisively as the Sino-Japanese War, but this final postcard here suggests that the meaning of the war, the meaning of Japanese victory, was quite frightful, because you see from top to bottom this yellow tiger slowly coming and beginning to kill all of the Western leaders, and then seemingly ready to take over the world. So when Japan won that victory of the Russo-Japanese War, many in the West saw Japan as a frightening new power in the world. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was very interested in the war, and he ended up becoming the peace broker. The Treaty of Portsmouth was signed in 1905, in which Japan got more territory and began to build more of its empire. They got the southern half of, I'll show you in a minute, Sakhalin. They went back to that peninsula that they had taken away from them and got the leasehold on it. And they got the rights to build a railway system in that peninsula. So by the end of the Meiji era then, in the 1890s and 1900s, Japan had started to build a formal empire that included Taiwan. They annexed Korea in 1910. This on the top is the southern half of Sakhalin, and then this is the Japanese mainland. So in the 1890s and 1900s, they had become a modern empire. They'd achieved that last checkbox to become a modern civilized power. But at the end of the Meiji era, and really at the end of the Russo-Japanese War, when the Meiji Emperor died in 1912, and this signaled the end of the Meiji era, because these reign names are all associated with the life of an emperor. When he died in 1912, many political leaders in Japan felt that Japan had become a great power, but the question was going to become, did the West really see them as such, and would they treat them as such? And that's really, I think, some of the key tensions that are going to lay the groundwork for what happens in 1931 when Japan invades Manchuria and begins a 15-year war to build a new order in East Asia and what we would call World War II. So I'll end this there and open it up for questions as well. I look forward to talking with you more about it.